In this way, both races have lived for a long time, in continuous contact at the same time that they are very separate, seeing each other every day and changing superficial words every day, but deeply separated from the moral and intellectual point of view, and not exerting any influence of importance. None of these influences that could be expected from continuous and direct contact. In primitive societies there were no such marked differences. The victor, whose superiority was relatively weak, easily improved the vanquished. Bagehot, 1877, p. 199. We have already seen that greed, a deep desire for power, for obtaining, for hatred were rationalized under scientific arguments, and modest speeches, loaded with manifest concern for the well-being of the oppressed. It must be assumed that an inferior people has to be sacrificed to achieve the good of humanity through the intervention of the victorious and more civilized people, which must undertake such sacrifice. This idea from my point of view results from the unconscious psychic transmutation of theological materials into political, biological, and sociological ones. The idea of sacrifice has a strong theological and unconscious implication. The one in charge of the sacrifice now turns out to be a substitute and symbolic priest. The latter must slaughter the offering at the altar, substituting the animal for a people or an expiatory nation, in such a way that the animal offering must be replaced by the black, the wild, the Indian and the indigenous, the uncivil, the slave, the little industrious, backward, and senile nations, who do not know how to govern themselves, and who must necessarily be assimilated and eliminated. These new colonialist priests will decide, through the use of their weapons, who is to be offered on the altars of war. The civilized and predestined nation has a priestly and divine mission, which consists in sacrificing other inferior nations, cleansing with their atoning blood the backwardness and obscurantism that humanity would have experienced, if such a race had survived. Therefore, the death of that expiatory race implies the supposed liberation and purification of humanity. This is the present sacrifice to obtain a better future. Due to the social changes experienced in the 19th century, the task of justifying the voracious desire for geophagy and ambition through religious discourses and theological arguments became increasingly difficult. Therefore, certain religious materials had to be rationalized and transmuted in the form of science, in philosophical, sociological, or political discourses. At the end of the 19th century, different currents of thought were created to give impetus to colonialist activity. At present we continue to use some terms such as discipline, interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. However, we do not believe it is convenient to discipline knowledge. The disciplines were a European construction for the service of growing colonization. The disciplines provided information to expanding European interests. From anthropology an attempt was made to scientifically demonstrate the existence of inferior peoples. From sociology, and Bagehottian psychology, as we have already seen, an attempt was made to demonstrate empirically that the concept of progress and civilization should be carried out solely by way of oppression and slavery. Biology had shown us the survival of the fittest, the inferior intelligence of women, due to their reduced cranial capacity compared to that of men. It was believed to see certain circuits in the human brain that clearly demonstrated the inferiority of women. It was believed in the biological superiority of the European over the other races, in the evident cruelty of nature, and as a result, the human impossibility of achieving progress through solidarity. From geography, the location of these new territories to colonize them was studied. It was necessary to know the climate, the topography, the fauna, the vegetation to be able to penetrate more easily in those territories. From politics and diplomacy, it was possible to annex the empires, the slaves, and the peoples oppressing them. Bagehot and the general opinion of the time affirmed that nature has been in charge of eliminating in each group the individuals who were not in harmony with the prevailing customs, which has robbed them of their vigor, and has killed them if they have been weak. Bagehot, 1877, p. 200. If we accept that nature is cruel, and that this reality is expressed in Carlyle's phrase, "Either you kill me or I kill you," human weakness as well as diseases, old age, disability, and deficiencies, should be interpreted as inferiorities that hinder the development of a nation and that nature itself should take care of discarding as soon as possible, since these subjects are not only unfit for war, but also produce economic losses to the state. At the end of the 19th century, it is already more difficult to apply the Spartan or Roman character, because in modern times societies are more tolerant in such a way that other substitute methods must be applied to achieve domination. One of the objectives of Beige-Hoshian sociology and psychology is to promote the idea that colonialism is not only not a destructive and deleterious activity, but is necessary for the progress and freedom of colonized peoples and humanity. From this point of view, Bagehot mentions the British intervention in India as a portion of inestimable benefits, thus assuming that the British give the Indians the enjoyment of continuous peace, commercial freedom, the right to live as you see fit as long as they submit to the laws. Bagehot, 1877, p. 214. It was even assumed without any qualms or brazenness that the inferior people that resists colonization are an ungrateful people, because they are opposed to being helped and aided. They resist the submission of a superior people who only want their protection and well-being. This resistance is due to their condition as inferior peoples, static and contemplative by nature, which does not allow them to adapt to the continuous changes made by the superior colonizing powers. A peaceful nation, without military force, that resists war and values solidarity and cooperation, must be considered a weak, timorous, passive, and static nation, predestined by nature to be dominated and subjugated. In India and China, where the concept of time is different from the European concept, their cultures are contemptuously viewed as static civilizations, founded on habit and customs. These characteristics are supposed to be clear evidence of their natural and racial inferiority for lacking continuous improvements as sought by European civilization. Therefore, in the same way as humanity, the East needs to be civilized by the Europeans, and England took on the difficult task of carrying out this colonialist evangelization. In a word, our task in the East is reduced to filling old wineskins with new wine, which is to say to ingest as far as possible a civilization whose soul is progress, within another whose science is inert immobility. Will we succeed or will our efforts be fruitless? This is perhaps the great question of our century, in which the most important political questions are more numerous than in any other. Historical investigations have shown us that the way of feeling of the Indians is ancient, and that of the English is modern. Bagehot, 1877, p. 215. The relationship between mobility, speed, movement, dialectic, and modernity, contrasts with the European concept of inert immobility and antiquity. The relationship between immobility and antiquity is, from a European perspective, typical of unproductive Eastern statism. Speed was related to the modern, to progress, the compulsion for work, factory production, motor energy, speed, characteristics of an anxious and compulsive society. On the other hand, the lack of that logical and European concept of speed was related to statism and backwardness, with wild and senile peoples, with the old, what has remained in the past, and in oblivion. Bagehot states that, without doubt, most civilizations have remained immobile. Even today, quietism and inertia are the general state of the world. Progress itself is but a rare exception, but we do not know why progress has appeared in an exceptional case, or what elements have been lacking for it to appear in all other cases. Bagehot, 1877, p. 216. Concepts such as immobility, stasis, habits, and customs, are closely related to backwardness and the primitive. The colonialist nations summon themselves and proclaim themselves to carry out a worthy expansionist and civilizing task, to which they have not been called. They consider themselves inspired by Providence to fulfill a redemptive mission, to guide senile nations that cannot govern themselves. The colonialist nations convinced themselves of doing great good to the colonized nations. They became convinced that they were bringing progress, economic freedom, and a myriad of inestimable benefits. In reality, they were dominated, plundered, its inhabitants eliminated or taken as slaves, forced to change their cultural and religious practices. Bede Griffiths notably expresses that the Western mind has divided the world into two halves, the conscious and the unconscious, the spirit and matter, the soul and the body, and Western philosophy oscillates between the two extremes of materialism and idealism. This is due to a disease of the mind, a schizophrenia that has developed in Western man since the Renaissance, in which the unitive vision of the Middle Ages is lost. The medieval view is in other respects inadequate, and Western man has to regain his balance by rediscovering the ancient world view, the perennial philosophy, which is fully developed in Vedanta and Mahayana Buddhism, but is implicit throughout ancient religion. Griffiths, N.D., p. 53. On the subject of India, J. Nehru states that the English colonization destroyed India, the textile industry collapsed, they destroyed the shipbuilding, metallurgy, glass, paper, and many trades industries. India's economic development was stopped. A vacuum was created in India that could only be filled with British products, and it also led to the rapid increase in unemployment and poverty. The classic type of colonial economy was built. India became an agricultural colony of industrial England, providing raw materials and a market for industrial products. The liquidation of the artisan class was the cause of unemployment of prodigious proportions. What were those tens of millions who until now had been dedicated to industry and manufacturing to do? Their old profession no longer existed, and the way was closed to them to adopt a new one. They could die, of course. The way out of a desperate situation is always open. And they died, indeed, by the tens of millions. The English Governor-General for the Indies, Lord Bentinck, reported in 1834 that misery hardly finds anything like it in the history of trade. Weavers' bones are bleaching the plains of India. Nehru, 1949, pages 414 to 415. Each colonizing power wanted to defeat the others militarily and consolidate itself as a single power. They longed to rebuild the idea of the Roman Empire, and to once again be as extensive, prosperous, and powerful as this empire was in the beginning. However, this undertaking was difficult to achieve. Charlemagne and Henry of Saxony, King of Germany, and his son Otoi had already tried unsuccessfully to rebuild the Roman Empire, whether from a conscious or unconscious aspect, were present. For the first time in Europe, the concept of Eurocentrism arises from certain historical antecedents, which occurred gradually and successively. Among them, the first take-off of the European Industrial Revolution, the period of the Enlightenment, the Wars of Independence of the United States, the French Revolution, and takes consolidation with the ideas of social Darwinism, by which it was interpreted that Europe had reached the highest point of evolution in the history of mankind, and the pinnacle of the phylogenetic ladder in social evolution before all other nations. This social Darwinism was transmuted from biology to imperialist politics in the Protestant nations, with greater intensity in England and Germany, passing since the 15th century from a Spanish Catholic monotheism to a Protestant monotheism. Footnote: note that throughout this work, I frequently speak of monotheism or monotheism and not religion. I do this to point out the psychological importance that Abrahamic monotheism has had in its different typologies, in the imperialist expansionism of European and Islamic nations. End of footnote. The idea of European historical linearity is related to the idea of Eurocentrism. It was believed that science and development had reached their climax without obstacles or shocks in a certain geographical place on the planet, considering China as a first point of Levant, passing through Greece, the Enlightenment, the Revolution Industrial, the French Revolution, until reaching the North German Anglo-Saxon Europe. We are taught that art, science, and technology had their genesis in Europe. However, today we know that the most transcendent discoveries began first in the Far East. For example, a book can be titled History of Art, Science, Technology, or Philosophy. However, its content will speak only or generally about the art, science, technology, and philosophy of Europe and Europe. Greece. The Eurocentric discourse tells us about something, but it also hides something from us. For Bagehot, the age of discussion, questioning, critical spirit, parliamentary debates began in Greece. It assumes that European man begins civilization at a certain geographical point, and that the age of discussion was manifested in a complete way as never before in the history of humanity, through the historians Herodotus and Thucydides. Listening over and over to the same European-centric discourses, they end up building unquestionable realities. We believe them because others previously believed them, because it must be so since they were learned from our infancy, because they are constantly repeated in textbooks, and in the teachings of our Eurocentric teachers and professors. Discourse builds reality, words have a power of conviction, especially when they are imposed as irrefutable and true teachings. If from our childhood we were taught that the printing press, the compass, gunpowder, and paper were created for the first time in Europe, we are going to believe it unconditionally, and we are going to internalize it. If we hear repeatedly that democracy first emerged in Greece, that scientific development flourished in a single geographic location and linearly, we will not only believe it, but will argue heatedly with those who oppose our irrefutable convictions modeled on our own childhood. If we read and hear in different sources the repetitive information that a European scientist made a certain discovery for the first time, we will believe it, even if that discovery was created hundreds or thousands of years ago, and very far from Europe. If we pay attention, we will notice that when the discourse refers to European scientists, philosophers, historians, it is always spoken of, first time, father of, the birth of a scientific discipline, carried out the first studies, described for the first time, that is, European originality is taken for granted without proper caution. It is a question here of an appropriation of the knowledge of one other, of a form of colonization of the creativity of one other. It is necessary to decolonize thought, it is essential for humanity itself since we are all involved to a certain extent, both colonized and colonizing nations, because this phenomenon responds to linked relationships of mutual dependence. I believe in the possibility of a universal, organic, complex, continuous, complementary historical reconstruction, without historical amputations or Eurocentricities. We continue to believe that the ancient inhabitants of what we know as America were discovered by the Spanish. We consent to terms such as Third World, First World, discovery of America, peripheral countries, countries of the center and many others. From my point of view, and following the unconscious process of historical transmutation, we can perceive that the discourse of power called Third World comes from the previous discourse of New World, already transmuted later, under the concept of wild peoples, and civilized nations. It is important to glimpse this historical process of transmutation, by means of which the discourse has been prolonged and distorted in time and space, until reaching the present. Whether it is rationalized under new manifestations of that discourse, on more developed nations and less developed nations, according to the logic imposed on the concept of development and developmentalism that the colonizing nations have imposed. This discussion that Bagehot boasts is nothing more than a form of manipulation and not integration. Women, slaves, and the vulgar, whom the bourgeoisie contemptuously called, could not participate in this discussion, which in reality constituted a means of manipulation. For Herbert Spencer, the government of ceremonial observations is the most primitive in the evolutionary process of societies. His speech contains a deep contempt for the weak and the weak who must necessarily submit to the strongest, and at the same time submit to the weaker than him. The savage does not obey any higher earthly power, he is only interested in ceremonial rules, leaving aside obedience. Therefore, it is necessary to unite and forcibly consolidate the dispersed peoples to be colonized, under a common law that subjects them to the superior law of the state. These peoples are scattered across the continents, and without that unifying law, domination will be impossible. Spencer refers to them as small and poorly united groups that hardly deserve the name of society. Referring to British rule in Australia, he claims that the savages form hordes scattered across the continent. They do not obey any political or religious authority. They only obey a considerable number of rules and ceremonials. It was impossible to come to value the knowledge of the First Nations under the influence of social Darwinism, since it had influenced all manifestations of knowledge, sociological, psychological, psychoanalytic, law, politics, science and European art. Social Darwinism represents an ideological construction of the 19th century bourgeoisie, as a means either consciously or unconsciously to justify and naturally rationalize expansionism and violence. The concept of time, which is related to progress, is taking on greater dynamism and speed in Europe, considering other non-European cultures as static. In Spencer's writings, we see the sociologist's contempt for the ingrained customs of these peoples, for their lengthy salutations, the scrupulous accuracy of performing their duties, for courtesy, lavish greetings, and ceremonial practices that take too long. Taking into account the importance of social Darwinism for the time, we must think that Europe, considering itself the pinnacle of universal social evolution, all other non-European nations necessarily had to be inferior because they were still on the path of the process. Evolutionary. This evolution had to manifest itself in a linear way, since if there had been certain historical and abrupt cuts in the evolutionary process, there is fear of the possibility of the existence of some other civilization long before the European one that has been technologically superior, and that for mysterious and unknown causes has disappeared in time. This possibility bothered the European and had to be rejected. For Bagehot, the custom broke its chains for the first time in Europe. In all corners of the planet, peoples were always traditional, intolerant, static, opposed to change, and therefore discussion, and democracy, appeared in Greece for the first time, reaching its splendor in German Anglo-Saxon Europe. It was assumed that all the nations that existed before the appearance of Greece, lived in the same way as their ancestors, a very backward time that avoided scientific development. It states that, doubtless most civilizations have remained immobile. Even today quietism and inertia are the general state of the world, progress itself is no more than a rare exception, but we do not know why progress has appeared in an exceptional case, or what elements have been lacking for it to appear in all other cases. History gives us a very clear answer that is worth taking into account. Here is what he tells us: the transition from the age of immobility to the age of free will took place for the first time in those states whose governments were evidently a government of discussion and in which the matters of discussion were to some extent questions abstract, that is, a matter of principle. In the small republics of Greece and Italy, the chain of custom was broken for the first time. Freedom said, "Let there be light," and Athens rose as the sun rises over the surface of the sea. Bagehot, 1877, p. 216. Note the relationship of Bagehot's speech to that of Hegel. The former affirms that for the first time in the city of Athens, the sun rises above the surface of the sea, freedom being born right there, at that very moment. For Hegel the sun rose in the east, and for Bagehot, it rose in Athens. The sun projects the light that guides us, represents justice, understanding, and leads us to the only monotheistic truth, separating the darkness of the wild peoples from the glare of the civilized nations. This light has descended from eternity to earth, and became incarnate in the form of nations whose providential, messianic, and predestined mission is to illuminate the future of humanity. It is interesting to note that the expression "let there be light" is found in the book of Genesis, to refer to creation. This spontaneous birth of civilization in Greece, which represents a mystery, has been granted by a providential and inexplicable will. We see here how historical events are tried to be explained through the unconscious influence of religion. Bagehot's Eurocentric and racist thinking automatically disconnects any link and possibility of influence between any other culture prior to Greek culture. The republics of ancient Greece were necessarily the first governments of this kind, not in history, but in time, and Athens was the largest of these republics. Bagehot, 1877, p. 217. Why in 19th century Europe was it believed that civilization hatched in Greece? Why was this historical myth defended, and still continues to be defended with frenzy? This fallacy began to decline with the crisis of reason and the Great Depression in the late 19th century. The aristocracy and the wealthy bourgeoisie saw their economic interests threatened, and they resisted violently in the face of the loss of power and influence. The unfortunate events of the Paris Commune in 1871, the terrible social conditions of poverty, hunger, misery, overcrowding, disease, crime, the great inequalities between poor neighborhoods and wealthy neighborhoods. The affirmation of the workers' parties of Marxism and anarchism, and the civil demands, marked the collapse of a prosperous age. These events brought as a reflection that all existence comes to an end sooner or later. All empires go through a time of decline and disappearance. Europe will cease to perceive itself as the end of Hegelian history. Juan Carlos Moreno Garcia notably expresses that, in these circumstances, archaeology also helped to undermine the notion of progress by showing that, in reality, many brilliant societies of the past had completely disappeared, replaced by barbarians who lived among the ruins of a splendid past. The Mayan cities devoured by the jungles of Central America, the gigantic complex of Angkor Wat in the Cambodian jungle, not forgetting pyramids, temples and cities in the middle of the empty desert of the Middle East, were just as many examples that the reversal from the top of the progress was possible. All this led not only to despise as barbarians and degenerates the descendants of such societies, Bedouin, indigenous, but also to judge as inconceivable that primitive peoples were capable of sophisticated achievements. A bloody example is the discovery of the Great Zimbabwe Complex, attributed to Phoenicians and other white peoples, since Africans could not be able to conceive and execute such extraordinary architecture. Or what to say of the complex irrigation networks that the French colonial administrators discovered in North Africa and that, naturally, could only be a Roman heritage, never a creation of indigenous populations. Garcia, 2004, p. 108. The European understood that civilization was typical of white man. Greece appears in the 19th century, as a civilization that is born suddenly, lowered and amputated, without historical antecedents, appearing suddenly as if by spontaneous generation. From Hellenocentrism it has passed to Eurocentrism, and later to an American centrism. To regard other civilizations, the Egyptians, the Arabs, the Indians, or the Chinese, as possible ascendants or influencers of European civilization would be an offense to the white, bourgeois Christian of the 19th century. All civilizations are inferior to the European, and therefore must be colonized as the only resource to expand the progress in the world, and the true religion. In the same way, it was considered despicable to accept that a great civilization such as the Egyptian, for example, could have been of the black race, since it is assumed that the black, being located in a position close to the animal kingdom on the phylogenetic scale, would never have the ability to create great architectural monuments or to produce science and technology. According to Bagehot, these debating governments reappeared in Europe, and Greece has been reborn in the 19th century. It has been idealized, incarnated in English culture. Bagehot concludes that civilization arose out of Greece, and that before it the world was primitive and static, although he acknowledges that, no doubt this independence from all concern, and this complete submission to reason, which I attribute to ancient Athens, most likely did not penetrate this city. Slaves and women did not enjoy these qualities. Bagehot, 1877, p. 232. Politics has been used as an instrument of power and control of nations, and for this it was necessary to remove all forms of thought regulated by custom, which represented an obstacle to the bourgeoisie, opposing its desire for expansion and influence. Therefore, when we speak of freedom and emancipation, we are speaking of the freedom of the bourgeoisie in order to achieve greater dominance and influence. According to the thinking of the time, the liberation of humanity began in Greece, because classical history is part of modern history. The Middle Ages is the only one that can be properly called ancient age. Bagehot, 1877, p. 230. The European made the mistake of believing that a certain culture can originate without a previous process, also denying any possible influence. This historical ablation denies the possibility of a process. It is assumed then that the concept of the beautiful, the artistic ideal, the architectural, the literary, spontaneously emerged at a certain historical moment. The liberation of humanity, as Goethe was used to calling it, emancipation, the movement that suffered for men the yoke of hereditary custom, of indisputable rigorous law, began in Greece and produced its main good or bad effects in Greece. Bagehot, 1877, p. 229. The European powers colonized a multitude of civilizations across the planet, and they undertook a symbolic colonization of Greece, that is, they incorporated it into European culture, they colonized it in a figurative sense, they appropriated it. Philosophy and scientific discoveries are supposed to have arisen first in Greece or Europe. It was very difficult to admit that nations inferior or less civilized than Europe had made important discoveries for humanity. Nor was there, nor is there today, the precaution and prudence to avoid adjudicating, a priori, a discovery without previously inquiring whether it was previously made, taking for granted the genesis of the discoveries to Europe or Greece. As an important factor but of psychological and unconscious origin, we can relate the idea of the sudden appearance of Greece with the belief in the theory of spontaneous generation and the idea of the sudden appearance of life, typical of the time. It is also likely that the ancient belief in spontaneous generation and the concept of the origin of life has been accepted and supported, inspired by this fallacy that strengthened theological convictions about other spontaneous forms described in the Pentateuch. Certain contents were transmuted from theology to biology and from there to politics. If the life of creation, and the plagues of Egypt arose spontaneously, why not believe then that the same phenomenon could have manifested itself in the same way from a biological and political plane? It was Louis Pasteur who, through the principle of biogenesis, demonstrated in the middle of the 19th century that life originates from a pre-existing life. Religion immediately embraced the theory of spontaneous generation because it prompted him to reaffirm the idea of the spontaneous creation recounted in Genesis and the spontaneous plagues that appear in the book of Exodus. If the theory of spontaneous generation was shown to be wrong, as it was done, then other arguments had to be found to continue supporting the belief in creationism. Herbert Spencer considers it wrong to read retrospectively in rudimentary minds developed ideas. It concludes that an Australian or a native of Tierra del Fuego wastes no time in forging a word with deliberate purpose, rather, the words that he finds in use and those of which he learns to use during his life, are the spontaneous product of onomatopoeia, of vowel sounds, which suggest to the spirit the qualities of certain objects, or of metaphors caused by the observation of some similarity. However, in civilized peoples, who have learned that words are symbolic, new words are often invented to serve as symbols for new ideas. The same happens with written language. The first Egyptians never thought of representing a sound by means of a sign. The monuments that remain of them began as that of the North American Indians begin today, by covering themselves with crude paintings representative of the events, whose memory they wanted to preserve. Herbert, N.D., p. 26. To the extent that ideas, customs are considered stationary, static, generalized, disordered, confused, dark, spontaneous, and are more disseminated and variegated, they will be phylogenetically located at a point that is closer and closer to the animal and lower nature. On the other hand, to the extent that they are more elaborate and clear, less confused, and more unified, they will be closer to the peak, in which European culture is supposed to be located, mainly the North German Anglo-Saxon nations. In this way, the religion that has been stripped to a greater extent of rites, has to be located closer to the phylogenetic peak. For this reason it is assumed that the Protestant religion, and therefore also the nations that have been shaped by it, is in a higher grade than the Catholic religion, which has a primitive character and whose ritualistic practices are more numerous, and therefore more confusing. For Spencer there is also an evolution of body odors. These odors are released more intensely from the skin of the savage, as they are located on a phylogenetic scale lower than European man, and closer to animals. He mentions the biblical account in which Isaac recognized Jacob by his smell, showing that among the Hebrews they recognized that different people, even members of the same family, have a particular smell. The more wild and primitive a certain people is, the more developed the sense of smell will be, and the stronger will be the smell that it gives off from its skin, due to the phylogenetic proximity to the animal. Herbert, N.D., p. 28. The sciences were at the service of colonialism, and instead of questioning it, they insisted on demonstrating the animal character of the inferior races. The marked influence of culture in the formation of human character, and its ability to adapt to any universal culture, could not be understood. It was ignored that culture imprints on the subject certain characteristics that are as intense as biology, and that it is often confused with it. In the colonizing trips, the European arrived in Polynesia, India, China, Africa, America, New Zealand, Australia, Samoa, Hawaii, and found different and varied cultures that already populated the continents, and in some cases they existed long before Europe developed as a civilization. This great cultural difference produced fear, amazement, rejection, and doubts. The customs of these peoples were strange to him because they were not familiar, nor did they respond to the uses and customs of Christianity. The European began to discover continents, islands, and spaces that had already been discovered and inhabited. Trying to explain different cultures gave him deep anxiety. The more he differed from exotic races and cultures, the more anxious he became. The black human, due to his great contrast with the white and civilized man, and because of his supposed phylogenetic approach to the animal kingdom, caused the European greater fear and contempt. Also for Spencer, the kiss has undergone an evolutionary process, and in the most backward cultures, it has been replaced by different practices. The kiss is a sample of hobby in the human species. However, this hobby is not shared by all races. The inferior ones replace it with the habit of snorting, and it has the same origin as the analogous act in animals. For Spencer, it can be a genuine expression of affection, but it can also be derived as a way of simulating affection. Spencer then states that, without a doubt, the use of the kiss is not universal, since the black race does not seem to understand it, and in certain countries it replaces it with the habit of snorting, but since it is found in different races and countries very far from each other, we can induce that it has the same origin as the analogous act in animals. Herbert, N.D., p. 30. Motivated by a deep contempt for the black race, Spencer comes to the conclusion that the black man cannot understand the effective use of the kiss and instead snorts as an animal might. It must be assumed that due to the same phylogenetic proximity that relates the black to the animals, the black race has not reached a certain evolutionary stage that allows it to kiss as the European does. The deepest human feelings are denied him, and his affections are stripped away. The black has no need to kiss, cannot love, nor is he capable of expressing feelings as the European does. It will not be necessary to do so, because the kiss is a means of expression of affections, and the black lacks them, or has them underdeveloped. It was then necessary for the European to remain emotionally distant from these inferior beings of black color, or with poorly colored skin, as Hegel expressed it. Similarly, Hitler will express later than human history. It shows with astonishing clarity that any mixture of Aryan blood with that of the inferior peoples, resulted in the ruin of the race, of the superior culture. North America, whose population is made up for the most part of Germanic elements who intermingled only on a minimal scale with racially inferior peoples of color, represents an ethnic world and civilization different from what are the peoples of Central America. And that of the South, countries in which emigrants mainly of Latino origin, mixed on a large scale with Aboriginal elements. This single example clearly allows us to realize the effect produced by the mixture of races. The Germanic element of North America, which racially preserved its purity, has become the lord of the American continent, and will maintain that position as long as it does not fall into the ignominy of mixing its blood. The crossing of two qualitatively unequal beings will tend to the degeneration of the pure race. Creative activity will be affected by science, art, and technique. Hitler, N.D., ch. 11. Hitler's Aboriginal, like Hegel's savage, is supposed to be biologically incapable of creating science, art, and philosophy. For Spencer, the hug has developed a phylogenetic evolution. Animals cannot express the act of hugging because their limbs are not made for apprehension, whereas in humans it is natural. In the Victorian era, strong feelings were to be avoided, because they were characteristic of uncivil peoples. The European had to control those low passions, except for the embrace of a mother to a son, which reveals an act of love and also of possession. The act of hugging was not worthy of the civilized man. Lewis and Clark tell us that, having found some Snake Indians, 3 men got off the horses at once to Captain Lewis and gave him very warm hugs. Mary says, "A Comanche took me in his muscular arms, while we were still mounted, and, resting his greasy head on my shoulder, gave me a grip as hard as a bear could have done." Snow also tells us that among the natives of Tierra del Fuego, the way of greeting friends is not at all pleasant. Men came to hug me in their arms with as much force as a bear could have done. Spencer, N.D., p. 32. Beyond the effective meaning, a hug can express a genuine feeling of love. For Spencer it has a mechanical meaning, by muscular actions, and practiced in countries where governmental subordination is weakly developed. Therefore the hug has little importance for the civilized and European man of the 19th century. It is important to observe the characteristics of the person who hugs: muscular arms, greasy head, grip so strong, like a bear, not at all pleasant, hugging me in his arms, with so much strength. He relates the savage to a strong, muscular, greasy, and obnoxious bear. This embrace of a non-European person, coming from the colonized lands, is like the embrace of an animal. The embrace of our victim can never be accepted as genuine. We could not understand that the conquered gives us a hug in return. During the Victorian era, intense affections were considered typical of a childhood stage of humanity, contrary to the use of reason and sanity. The savage, the child and the woman, expressed these spontaneous affections. Precisely the Victorian era coincides with a growing colonizing period, the colonization of India, the Opium Wars, and anthropological studies that related the spontaneous affections of the conquered savage with animal behavior. Affective expressions, gestures, clapping, making noise, or snapping fingers when greeting, jumping for joy, hugging, and expressions of joy. Emotional excess is associated with animal behavior. Grunts, screams, loud expressions, moans, and wails. It has been very difficult to understand that the feared and despised primitive man is not outside of us, but coexists in the depths of our unconscious. The sociological and anthropological study of the 19th century, full of Eurocentric racist prejudice, could not understand the value that each culture has in itself and with it the value of the human being in himself, regardless of the culture to which he belongs. He insisted on demonstrating and preserving the stubborn idea that civilization arose spontaneously in Greece, and that all peoples and civilizations, even Greece, are inferior to the nascent colonialist Europe. Bourgeois thought endeavored to demonstrate anthropologically that except in Greece, in Renaissance Italy, and essentially in 19th century North German Anglo-Saxon Europe, the history of humanity was the history of barbarism. He also insisted on exhibiting numerous examples in order to prove the cruelty of the savage man in contrast to the civilized European man. The European projected his own destructive impulses onto the savage, his hatred, his selfishness, his fears, seeing in the construction of the savage the projected aspects of himself. To demonstrate the unusual violence of the savage, Spencer makes a systematic compilation exposing refined beheadings, mutilations, displays of body parts as trophies, cannibalism, skinned heads, to reach the conclusion that the savage is necessarily cruel by nature and by therefore to justify the action of the European white man who must exterminate them for the benefit of humanity. It was assumed that Europe had reached the phylogenetic cusp of civilization, and therefore it would be impossible that these irrational actions that we mentioned, which characterize only the senile peoples, could be historically repeated. This pristine stage of humanity has been buried in oblivion. Both Spencer and Bagehot, and the arrogant generation that believed they had reached the phylogenetic pinnacle of social progress, died without having seen the devastation of the European wild man, inspired by sociological and anthropological ideas and deep racial hatred, expressed in through National Socialist politics in the first half of the 20th century. Regarding the affections, for Spencer there are no genuine feelings of love and solidarity among the savages, and by extension among all humans. In relation to this, it states that declarations of caring for the good of others and for the good success of their businesses have an older origin than declarations of submission. The hugs and kisses that indicate affection serve as fulfillment among the savages little or not governed at all, who do not know the custom of prostrating themselves. For that reason friendly speeches precede those that express subordination. Spencer, N.D., p. 218. Submission is ranked above the affections of love and solidarity, understanding that these affections have a phylogenetic origin older than submission. Not only is it not capable of seeing the importance of love in human relationships, but it also considers these deep affections as primitive forms of relationship. The custom of prostrating slavishly before other people comes from historical forces under the sacred humiliation of prostration before the monotheocentric God, according to the Christian typology, substituting the intangible God for the king, the prince, or another representation of perceptible power. Submission to a divine and immaterial sovereign has been transmuted into submission to tangible human representations. These customs of submission and prostration before a visible other were falling into disuse in the 19th century with greater speed due to the process of colonization of nations modeled by Protestantism, a staunch opponent of such idolatrous practices. Even the custom of prostration, according to Spencer, reveals the attitude of the defeated in the presence of the victor. These accomplishments were destined to gain the benevolence of the victor, the sovereign, and they confess defeat and servitude. Therefore the colonizing superior nations do not have to carry out any fulfillment, since they themselves deserve the prostration of beings conquered and inferior. Statements of being interested in the welfare of the other, of success in business, have a more primitive origin than direct statements of submission. That is why arms and kisses are considered as compliments among the little or no ruled savages. In other words, among the savages who have not yet been militarily subjugated by the European expansionist forces. These savages are waiting to be conquered, they do not yet know the custom of prostrating and obedience, therefore, these long salutations, these effective manifestations, even of genuine love, have to disappear before submission. Because friendly speeches precede those that express subordination. Spencer, N.D., p. 218. The fallacy into which Spencer and the paradigm of the time fell, was to believe that Western societies are freer, or less despotically ruled than the savage peoples who are. He thinks of them as homogeneous. They are all equally accused of cannibals, immoral, violent. Therefore, it is only possible to interpret his declarations of friendship not as genuine feelings but as expressions of submission. Although the European free nations of the 19th century resisted submitting to material idols, to complicated and confusing rituals, to tangible and intangible powers, they nevertheless remained prey to expansionist forces whose religious components were already deformed and integrated into political forms. It was still latent. It is true, there were no longer any golden calves to worship, there were no more primitive superstitions or taboos, or disgusting customs, but it was ignored that these so-called primitive forces continued their existence in the unconscious of the new nations. The tangible idolatry had been transmuted under the form of a new cult of industrialization, the nation, capital, having, militarism, the pride of being superior, believing it was predestined to be the light of humanity. The Europe shaped by the industrialized and Protestant nations believed in the existence of another Europe, backward, and made up of the nations shaped by ritualistic and idolatrous Catholicism. On this evolution Spencer affirms that, without more than looking back at the backward regions of Europe such as Naples and Sicily, we see there that the observance of rites occupies much more place in religion than obedience to moral precepts. Finally, let us remember that Protestantism, a religion whose rites are less complicated and less imperatively prescribed, and where the composition that rescues transgressions by means of expressive acts of submission is not usually admitted, does not date from long, and that the spread of dissident Protestantism is still much more recent, in which this change is carried further. Proof that the subordination of ceremonies to morality is not a character of religion, but in its most modern forms. Spencer, N.D., pp. 21-22. When Spencer refers to the backward regions of Europe, he refers to the Catholic regions. The influence of Catholicism was conceived as an economic and cultural backwardness for the peoples that adopted it. As we have already mentioned, nations shaped by Protestantism rejected mendicant orders. Deep-rooted Catholic traditions were interpreted as stationary, typical of static nations, and complex acts of ritualistic submission, interpreted as idolatry, as a waste of time. For the speed that industrialized society demanded. It was also understood that it was easier to achieve social and economic changes within the Protestant context than within the Old Catholicism, where adherence to tradition did not allow such intervention. In the main parts of Europe, and mainly in England, the influence of religion has been very different from what it had been in antiquity. We could call it influence of discussion. After the times of Luther, a conviction has taken root in the spirits, and it is that man can, by the effort of his intelligence, form his own religion, and that he must choose or create what suits him best, fulfilling the most important of all your duties. The influence of political discussion and religious discussion have continued to fade for a long time, have provided such effective support that the old notions of fidelity, of submission to the sovereign, the principle of authority, such as existed in the Middle Ages today have almost no rule over the best spirits. Bagehot, 1877, pages 237 to 238. To understand the colonial process, it is necessary to interpret the religious beliefs that gave a strong impulse to religious and political expansionism. Although the concept of sin for Christianity has a universal scope, the concept of soul did not. A way was sought to theologically lower the Indian to the height of the animals to justify domination and thus suffocate any possible Christian guilt that may manifest itself. Because if the Indian does not feel, does not express emotions, he is not a person. Because if he is an idolater, an opponent of Christianity, despicable, abominable, sinful, unfaithful, in short, if it does not have a soul, then its elimination should be interpreted as the suppression of a diabolical curse bringing with it an awakening for humanity. We must differentiate the concept of absence of the soul from the immortality of the soul. The absence of soul in certain pagan groups, in a concept that was born from the first contacts between Catholic Spain with the so-called New World. It is a discussion that begins to take place from a Catholic perspective. In the Protestant texts of the time, no such theological discussion appears. In Calvin's Institutions of the Christian Religion written in 1536, and in Lutheran writings, I have not found any quotation on the subject of the absence of the soul. The idea that the ancient inhabitants of the New World did not have a soul, became a means of justification for treating them as animals, since it was believed that they did not have a soul. However, a being without a soul could not be evangelized, because it would not be able to understand and accept the message of Christian salvation, since it is assumed that thanks to the existence of the soul the truth can be known, because the soul connects him directly with providence. In view of these theological interpretations, Pope Paul III in his bull Sublimis Deus in 1537 declares that we, although unworthy, exercise the power of our Lord on earth. We nevertheless consider that the Indians are true men and that they are not only capable of understanding the Catholic faith, but that according to our information, they are eager to receive it. Carlos III comes to the conclusion that Western or Southern Indians are human beings capable of faith and salvation, and they can receive the Catholic faith because they have human nature. The Bull Sublimis Deus de Paulo 315341549. While it is true that there is a request for piety towards the Indians, it is also true that evangelization is required of them and thus the loss of their cultural identity to embrace the only monotheocentric truth in its Christian typology. The authoritarian character often tends to preserve, care for, protect the object that belongs to it, but in exchange for its own freedom and expansion. The belief in a mortal soul was unthinkable for 16th-century Protestant Christianity. While it is true that there were certain religious groups that were based on Aristotelian thought to destroy the immortality of the soul, however, the idea of mortality of the soul was rejected by Christianity and considered by Calvinism as a heresy. Calvin affirmed that the soul is immortal, and that since it is not linked to the body, it can subsist without it. So the faculties of the soul that serve the body are not enclosed in the body, they are not dependent on it. The soul and the body share a unit. The soul was defined as an immortal essence, though created, which is the noblest part of man. Sometimes in scripture it is called spirit. When these two names occur together, they differ from each other in meaning, but when the name spirit stands alone, it means the same as soul. Calvino, N.D. The body does not fear divine punishment, but the immortal soul. For the sense of brute animals does not go outside the body, or at most it does not extend beyond what the eye see, but the agility of the soul of man, penetrating heaven, earth, and the secrets of nature, and after having understood the whole past with his understanding and memory, by arranging everything according to its order and by deducing the future from the past, he clearly shows that there is a hidden part in man that differs from the body. Calvino, N.D. The soul is the noblest part of man, therefore, although there is a concept of unity insofar as both make up the same entity, there is also a hierarchy of the soul over the body, considered as the least noble. We are not talking here of unity based on co-equality, but on the concept of superior-inferior, dualism, debate, irreducible entities, realities that never agree, and where the soul is prisoner of the body, waiting for the death of this one, in order to free himself from his oppression. Where the material is the jailer of the immaterial, where the visible opposes and oppresses the invisible. This dualistic concept has influenced Western thought. It does not present a harmonic unity but a forced and inevitable unity, that is, both entities have to coexist even if they do not want it due to the requirement of the curse of original sin. We must take into account certain historical facts of great importance as antecedents: the discovery of America in 1492, the Lutheran Reformation in 1517, the fragmentation of Catholicism, the discovery, at least for the European, of the heliocentric theory, by Nicolaus Copernicus, for which the human being was questioned as the center of the universe. The beginning of the English Navy in Henry VII, and the break with the Catholic Church in Henry VIII's England. Footnote: China had already discovered such a phenomenon. It was not conceived for the first time by Aristarco de Samos as it is believed. End of footnote. Copernicus's discovery called into question anthropocentric thinking grounded in theology. The Earth is no longer the center of the universe, therefore, man is no longer the center of divine creation as believed. The doctrine of the soul had to be revised in the same way as the entire theological structure. God no longer had direct power over creation. There were natural causes and forces that were independent of the divine aspects. There has been a change in the worldview, a secularized explanation of reality was given. It was no longer necessary to understand God in each natural action, and give a divine intervention to each one of the phenomena. Considering it profane, the philosophical idea of a universal spirit that sustained the world was rejected. This idea, inspired by the poet Virgilio, affirmed that nature has a divine spirit, a mind of its own, an intelligence that moves the stars and governs them, moves the machine of the world continuously, maintains the life of man and the animals. That is to say, the world has been created by a god, but it is creator at the same time. This idea was expanding during the Renaissance, being rejected and considered as diabolical by wide sectors of Christianity. God, the creator of all that exists, no longer directly moves the stars and the planets, but these they orbit by natural forces, by themselves, without a divine hand that governs them constantly and continuously. The universal soul is the concept that gives being to the world, that maintains it, preserves it, and does not directly need the intervention of God. These ideas unleashed strong criticism. The natural forces began to be ranked above the belief in a divine, constant and direct intervention. God will gradually cease to govern nature, because it can govern itself. During the 15th and 16th centuries, and based on the events already mentioned, theology has had to make certain changes and revisions. Calvin wondered how it is that pagans and sinners created the sciences. How can it be that God gives greater inspiration and intelligence to sinners than to men of faith? Those predestined for eternal salvation, those who obey the orders of providence, are supposed to be the most intellectually favored. Calvin gives an answer, by stating that the spirit of sanctification is the one that reigns in the faithful and not in the pagans. However, God wanted that the infidels serve us to understand physics, dialectics, mathematics, and other sciences. Let us make use of them in this, fearing that our negligence will be punished if we despise the gifts of God wherever they are offered to us. Institutions of the Christian Religion Book 2, 16. By believing in an absolute truth that must be accepted unconditionally, all curiosity to know beyond what is allowed by God,